of the biggest names in music history have had a huge rivalry going for over 60 years now. And it seems like it's going to keep going for as long as members of those bands are alive. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones. The Beatles and the Stones' histories are well covered by now, but briefly, John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and Paul McCartney formed the Beatles in 1960. Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Charlie Watts, Brian Jones, and Bill Wyman got together and called themselves the Rolling Stones 2 years later in 1962. Both bands had some lineup changes over the years, and the Stones lost Brian Jones, who died in 1969. But they both kept their core members since the very beginning. They've made more money than anyone can count, somewhere in the billions, if not trillions of dollars if you put their earnings together, and they've had a competition longer than any other bands in musical history, at least that I'm aware of. When two groups of people are consistently in competition with each other for years, you know there's going to be both praise and insults over that period. It started when the Beatles and the Stones met each other in 1963, and they went to Paul McCartney's house to party until 4 in the morning. That same year, the Stones heard the Beatles were recording, and when they went to go see them, the Beatles told Mick Jagger and his crew they could have a song they just recorded. The track, called I Wanna Be Your Man, got to number 12 on the charts, their biggest hit at the time. Both sets of musicians would go on to sing with each other in 1967, with some of the Beatles singing on the Stones' Their Satanic Majesty's Request album. John Lennon and Yoko Ono would join the Stones on a TV special in 1968, and Brian Jones from the Stones would play saxophone on the Beatles song You Know My Name, right before his death by drowning in 1969. In 1970, though, John Lennon would lash out in an interview that Mick Jagger had only ever copied the Beatles throughout their entire career. The epic interview had several quotes which insulted Jagger, and Lennon would go on to say he's obviously so upset by how big the Beatles are compared with him, he never got over it. Eventually, the Beatles would break up, and a decade later, John Lennon would be murdered December 8, 1980. And the Stones members took his death very hard. According to Keith Richards, they originally thought Lennon would survive. He said in an interview years later that he was stunned, and then realized it was the entire world that was stunned after hearing about Lennon's death. Things would go quiet between both bands until 1987, when Mick Jagger was promoting a solo tour. There was a lot of speculation the Stones would break up, and Mick was quoted as saying, "No one should care if the Stones have broken up, should they? I mean, when the Beatles broke up, I couldn't give a shit." A year later in 1988, Mick would induct the Beatles into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He said in a speech there was a lot of rivalry in the early years, and a little bit of friction, but that they ended up as friends. In 1995, Jagger would give another interview and say it was due to Lennon and McCartney's strong personalities which caused the Beatles to break up. Years later in 2015, Keith Richards called the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band rubbish, and would say that they couldn't cut it when performing live. In 2020, Paul McCartney gave an interview and said that while both bands are friends, the Beatles were better. Jagger would answer back and say that the difference between the two groups were that the Stones have been a bigger concert band for decades, and the Beatles never really did an arena tour. In 2021, McCartney called the Stones nothing more than a blues cover band, and in that same year, Jagger joked that the former Beatles were going to join them on stage for a blues cover song. Paul McCartney is still touring at 79 years old, and the Stones could be doing the exact same thing very soon. According to Rolling Stone magazine, the Stones have brand new material, and Mick Jagger is still going strong, performing at 78 years old. Time will tell if their feud and rivalry or friendship continues.